Alright, so like back in August 10th, I was sent something, podcast called the Higher Side Chats. Give it a listen, I was told. So I listened to it then, and then I listened to it again like a couple days ago, and I tried to make one of these, like what I'm doing right now. But I was playing the audio on my computer, but apparently my camera doesn't pick up the audio coming from the internet if I'm cameraing, so then I'm going to use this phone to play the. We're going to go over it, and I'm going to do what I did, hopefully as well as the first time, because it was awesome the first time I did it, but then it didn't have any audio from the chat, so it just was me staring at this and saying shit every once in a while. But, the guy's name is Dan Winter. Apparently he's getting paid a lot, and a smart guy and whatnot. Let's try this. Let's try this.
In the 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed the nation through a series of radio broadcasts known as the Fireside Chats. His aim was to reassure the common man that our society would recover from its troubled times. Well, we're far from 1930, and I deal with a different kind of fire. For a new era of worldly frustration, we offer a fresh conversation. I'm Greg Carlwood, and these are the Higher Side Chats. Rock me like a hurricane, Higher Side Chatters from sunny San Diego. I'm Greg Carlwood, and we have talked to many people working in the realms of energy, medicine, physics, and even magic, who all share similar stories, and that there are better ways waiting for us just beneath the surface of the corporate-controlled paradigm we're all taught are the biggest and best advancements known to man and a testament to modern-day progress. But when you learn about the outer edges of these fields and the people who dared to dig outside of the designated areas, you find that the technologies and systems the world is presented with as cutting-edge progress are really just mechanisms of finely tuned profit, coupled with the denial that anything else exists. So whether it's cancer-curing tea, cannabis oil, rife devices, exotic principles of electricity, torsion physics, alchemy, ether, zero-point energy, flying saucers, remote viewing sigils, or the pentagram, how can you not be curious about how well these things work?
The pentagram, or a 5-pointed star, is just a 1 of 7 of 13 of 110 of 2143. We've covered this.
Work. Well, wouldn't you know it, today we're talking to a guest who knows about all these things and more. His name is Dan Winter, and his background spans a broad spectrum of disciplines, but he's probably best known for advancing the science of fractality. He graduated with honors at the University of Detroit, then he pursued graduate studies in psychophysiology and the origins of languages. He's worked as a systems analyst.
Origins of languages, again, back to the discussion that everyone thinks they need to learn another fucking language and read a bunch of fucking books in a fucking language I don't fucking care about. It's called common tongue. What else is common? Language of mathematics. Oh, okay, we got English, which is common tongue, and then mathematics is language that doesn't lie. Only humans lie, but math doesn't lie. Let's see where he goes with this.
IBM, as well as an industrial metallurgist and crystallographer. Dan also studied at the Gurdjieff School of Sacred Gymnastics in Florence with Buckminster Fuller and at Feinhorn. Dan draws on many sources, including science, mythology, popular culture, and even channeled information, looking for ideas about the deep connectedness of all things and how the profound nature of our oneness can be approached from architecture or art, math or biology, electronics or myth. You can find most of his diverse work spiraling out of his main hub at fractalfield.com, and we should all prepare to have our minds thoroughly blown. A Dan of many trades, a connector of dots as well as hearts, and the professor of plasma vortexes, Dan Winter, welcome to the Higher Side.
Wow, and I thought I talked fast. You're doing great.
I try, man. Gotta get them set up, and this is complex stuff, but it is certainly a pleasure. It took me a long time to wrap my head even halfway around your work, but I kept coming back to it because I've had many listeners request that I get you on here, and today is the day. And I think the crux of what you're about for listeners' context is that the universe is fractal, everything is energy, and so many of life's mysteries become clear when you understand what a plasma vortex is and how it becomes centripetal through phase conjugation. And to clarify that, think of a tornado and the eye of the storm. Think of how...
You mean an eddy current?
That visual visual relates to the feeling that facilitates astral travel, or even look at a pentagram and you can see how many different seemingly unrelated things are trying to reference or harness this vortex shape, and it's kind of the key to everything, it seems. Is that a decent...
No, it's not. That equation, which is my equation, that's the key to everything.
elevator pitch? How would you amend that?
Wow, you're doing such a good job. I think I'm going to retire. No, actually, it's really true. I became quite frustrated as an electrical engineer and systems analyst. It appeared that today's science really does not know why anything is centripetal, and therefore does not know why anything is self-organizing, or it's called negentropic, which is to say, why does anything emerge from chaos in principle? And so I really was researching that, and I discovered it's true that fractality is the answer, but it is very specific what I discovered. I discovered if you take the wavelength, which is the musical key signature of the universe, named Planck length at time, is 1.61 times 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, and every wave that physics has ever measured fits evenly into that, so it's a musical key of all of physics. And then you simply multiply repeatedly by golden ratio, and you get things like I discovered, the radii of hydrogen. And so now, if you look at a top-down view,
Well, that makes it a little better.
Pentagrams, that's literally the physics of how hydrogen is assembled. And that stellation by golden mean ratio.
A stellation. I talk about stellations and dodecahedrons and icosahedrons where it reduces to its own stellation. The con of stellation is in our skies because it's the map of how to construct a battery. Because to bring heaven to earth, you got to be smart enough to know you live in a battery. Then you got to figure out how to build a battery. That's why I use Genesis 1 of the KJV, Kevin Janik version. My Bible.
By definition, the perfection of self-similarity, which is the principle of what fractality is. And further, that now suddenly answered the question of how hydrogen is making gravity, which contains this clue, why does any object...
How can hydrogen contain gravity? Let's say this is the cell, and we live on the interior walls of the beach ball. So the very center of the beach ball would be a single point, a 0 point. And all the light gases would gravitate towards that point, and all the dense shit would be on the outside walls of the beach ball.
All to the ground. So
that's
by
gravity.
Discovering that this golden spiral is the structure of hydrogen, the universe and everything living, and DNA and every living protein, we also discovered why certain items are centripetal and thereby implosive and self-organizing. And we've implemented that in 3 or 4 major technologies already. It's pretty exciting.
Yes, this is really fascinating stuff. That's a great summary. And I've heard you say that if you truly understand what a plasma vortex is, then you can understand how shamans steer tornadoes. And that is a fascinating subject. What can you say about that?
Well, the point is to understand how.
And I'm crazy? This guy gets paid money.
Becomes centripetal. So first, we need to say what plasma is. Plasma is essentially a cloud of charge, which is what the universal ether, being a compressible superfluid, is made of. So everything that's alive is essentially made of a cloud of charge that's formed a tornado. It's actually true. But inherent to what we need to talk about here is for people to understand how these vortex got centripetal in the first place, began to implode. And then we can talk about how mind is the centripetal force, literally the physics of consciousness. So step 1 would be to talk about exactly why it is that golden ratio affected fractality.
Keep it simple,
Causes the
Dan Winter.
Named gravity and consciousness. So if you look at the way the waves are converging,
it gets better.
Golden ratio is the only ratio that allows waves to add and multiply recursively constructively. And that's the definition of self-similarity and fractality and perfect embedding and the physics behind what science calls.
How about you get gain to get perpetual motion?
Now that we see
slow and steady wins the race, Dan.
Perfected adding and multiplying of wave
gain
recursively, which only golden ratio allows. Perfected heterodyne, it's called, which means wave length and wave velocity are adding and multiplying recursively. affected heterodyne. So as the wave is approaching on that, visualize a nest of pentacles, 10 spirals of the golden mean. There's lots of graphics at fractalfield.com. So when the waves cross at each of those nodes, they add and multiply recursively and constructively, not just wavelength, but what's called wave phase velocity.
The dual
That's the fun
wave
part, because
particle.
suddenly now the velocities of
Wave
the wave
particle
front
duality.
are adding and multiplying constructively as they approach the center. So the golden ratio fractality allows the phase velocity to add and multiply as it's going towards center in addition to the wavelength and frequency, meaning the speed of the wave increases as it moves towards center. And that acceleration of charge down only the golden ratio vortex.
Light can bend in a glass fiber. Light can bend in air. You think light in air is linear? It's curved. And it bends towards the center where all light is emitted from the center, 0 point of our battery that we live in, called space, or the planet of ET. The plan of ET is to create a battery in a battery. Our planet is a big-ass bubble.
Is what is the reason hydrogen makes gravity.
All of space is in the
Because
middle.
gravity is simply
All of
named
it.
for acceleration.
It's
of charge.
contained.
Yes. So now for the first time, unlike Einstein, NASA, and Stephen Hawking, you could tell your children why an object falls to the ground after my new equation that hydrogen is fractal. Now you can visualize a vortex based on pentacles and golden ratio that's imploding charge towards center. Actually, what's happening is the charge is accelerating through the speed of light at exactly what's called Planck threshold we just talked about, and that what's called transverse up and down wave becomes a what's called longitudinal compressional wave, which is literally a gravity wave. And the proof, the smoking gun that I'm right, is when Professor Raymond Chow proved that the most common velocities actually measured faster than light center exactly around golden ratio times the speed of light. So that's proof that my theory of gravity is correct. That it's caused by golden ratio fractality. So now you can...
Anyone get that? What kind of fuckery is this?
think about what could make a vortex implode. Then we can have the rest of our fun conversations, including, how a shaman steers a tornado. But was that much clearer, do you think?
Yes, I think so. And I have actually talked to some people who are magically inclined to have been able to mentally create weather effects. So it's not really outside of the realm of things we've talked about before, but you explain it so well. And is this something you've seen firsthand yourself?
Well, 30 years of pretty intense kundalini, and I also teach the physics of rainmaking, which is an introduction to steering tornadoes. Most children, if they're sort of...
I guess steering tornadoes is like a third-year course that you could take.
And dancing barefoot in the soil, so they're grounded. If they focus on a cloud, they can put a hole in the cloud. We teach the electrical engineering of how that happens, that the brainwave cascade also becomes golden ratio, the physics of bliss. We measure that at flameandmind.com. And so
He owns all the .coms.
Centripetal
Physics of bliss.
So when you focus in a cloud, you're actually creating what's called implosive or centripetal capacitance.
Now everyone's going to fuck with the clouds, Dan.
Charge that causes the water vapor to converge, which is the physics of crystallization or Christos, which is how a droplet forms.
What are you talking about?
Water vapor to touch. Another example is this well-known by measurement Bill Tiller that focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. That's measured and proven.
My whole channel is trying to get focused human attention.
I'm the first one to explain how and why focused consciousness causes electrical compression.
Oh.
We now know exactly why. Because consciousness is a centripetal plasma vortex. Another example of that is the many children, of course, who are able to see without their eyes, very well-known phenomenon. We teach children to see without their eyes. flameandmind.com/outer vision. And
that's another .com.
They make a cascade in their brainwaves, which is measurable and teachable. They go to relaxed trance bliss. And then they all report they see a small vortex tunnel open up inside their head, literally a tube, and they look through it like an eyeball, and they can see perfectly blindfolded and do everything. The interesting physics here is that also explains why so many shamans...
How do you know what the chair looks like if you've never seen a chair before? What?
And near-death experiences can take their vision outside their head, because vision is a plasma vortex that's pulled together and focused enough to form literally an eyeball called phase conjugate perception at the center. So,
don't believe what you see. Your eyes can deceive you. Optical to digital converter. You think you see the light that hits your eyeball as linear with a curved eye? Must have a concave source to make it linear.
well, that is about plasma tornadoes.
Oh, or plasma tornadoes. One of those.
Yes, and when talking about these things with many different guests, it just seems like everybody kind of has their own terminology, but are oftentimes speaking about similar things like Indra's net, or just this lattice work of energy that connects all things. Some people say ether.
The lattice work? Yeah, the thing in my window?
People are saying plasma. But do you consider some of these terms interchangeable? I know you want to stick to your terminology, but are other people out there trying to talk about the same thing? It's just not really in our culture, so it's really hard to nail down?
Excellent question. You know, many metaphors like Indra's net are actually beautiful and useful. However, if we use strictly measurable electrical engineering terms, then we can understand better how the collective unconscious works, how you make phone calls to ancestors. We've measured the fractality of the air, where ancestor phone calls are possible. We've determined from Cozy Rev the place where the Cozy Rev mirror enables military quality telepathy. You know exactly how to measure the place you have to put it. Specifically, the correct electrical engineering term is longitudinal interferometry. Essentially, remember that vortex that came to focus where the pine cones kiss noses precisely at the Planck distance, that launches a longitudinal compressional wave, incorrectly called scalar. And those waves can go through about anything. The only way their inertia bounces back into transverse, where we can see them measurement, are at the compression nodes of a fractal array. Primary example would be the dodecahedron Earth grid. And those nodal
dodecahedron
has been measured. That nuclear critical mass is reduced. We know exactly why, and that only essentially at those points, their relatives, is telepathy possible, etc. So the best place for labyrinth, cathedral.
Hey, talk about the pine cone.
So what's called sacred space, those compression nodes are a place where transverse and longitudinal inertia couple. That's called embedding. So that is the array. For example, if you, as Korotkov did, follow the Cody, where they make phone calls to ancestors and measure the fractality of the air. We measure in 3 different ways. You can see that at goldenmean.info/architecture. The point being that once you've identified as an electrical engineer, what had been called sacred space was just simply non-destructive compression, fractality of the air, a longitudinal node. Then you can identify precisely the place where cathedral, labyrinth, stone circle, ancestor phone calls, and birth and death are successful. Indra's net.
Yes, you are touching on so many things that I want to get deeper into. But a primary thing I've heard you talk about that I think is really fascinating is John Dee and Edward Kelly, because we know about the Enochian channelings, but not really much else. And I've heard you talk about their work in alchemy, the connection to Shakespeare, and that they actually steered one of these very tornado-like storms to wipe out the Spanish Armada. These are the kinds of things I would love to know more about. It seems like many, many things are possible when you really harness this energy and have a real understanding of its multiple applications.
Well, good question, and that is an area that we've done a lot of work. But then we need to go back, because I didn't finish talking about the actual physics of how a tornado is steered by a shaman, which wouldn't be necessary to introduce that conversation.
Sure.
And the physics, if you were clairvoyant enough and you're watching a shaman steer the tornado, you would observe the bioplasmic streamers emerge from the belly of the shaman, and they would be sucked into what's called embed in the center of the tornado, to the point where the shaman becomes electrically the center of gravity of the tornado. Now, psychologically, what's happening is the shaman says, I'm eating the tocha, which is almost close to saying I'm eating the anger or eating the pain. And by feeling the pain of a tornado, for example, the tornado passes over metal buildings, that's called pain, because those are places where charge cannot explode. And so the tornado goes out of its way to destroy a metal trailer park, where a tornado will never hurt a sacred stone circle because that feels like part of its body. So anyway, the tornado then falls in love with the shaman and chooses to follow it around. That's a psychological description. But the hydrodynamic or electrical engineering description is the center of the shaman's attention has literally become the center of low pressure and therefore the steerage of that tornado. Even human attention creates the center of lowest pressure.
Good electrical and engineering terms there, bud.
So it's literally
Someone really likes the electrical engineering degree.
That enables the shaman to steer the tornado. Which is another way of, if you look at the electrical order of the heartbeat, it's a series of concentric donuts around kg. And when you turn it inside out recursively, constructively, that is literally the physics of compassion. Reaching out and letting the outside embed on the inside. You literally turn yourself inside out.
Outside on the inside. Bringing heaven to earth.
How tornadoes form and are steered. So that introduction of both the plasma and the psychology of steering tornadoes. I mean, I have to admit that after so many years of Kundalini, I've done a lot of rainmaking. Stories at goldenmean.info/rain. But now we might be more ready to go toward your question about John D. and Kelly. Well, all of that story is at goldenmean.info/Ophanim. And we also have a beautiful, it's called Alchemy, Ophanim, Enochian study group on Facebook you could check into as well. Basically, I had a partner, Vincent Bridges, who was an expert in D and Kelly. I sort of became that as well. And it is true that we are pretty clear that John Dee told Queen Elizabeth in England, perhaps a year ahead of time, he was going to make the storm that took out the Spanish Armada. It was a plan. And we believe that Francis Garland, well documented in John Dee's notebook, was in fact Shakespeare. There's lots of evidence, and you can read there as well. And that became The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and it became, what's that famous Shakespearean play? Anyway, so John Dee went to the 7 hills of Prague. It's a long story, but the magnetic map of Prague is in fact Rose, and used what's called the Ophanim Enochian calls, which we have a lot of experience with. Basically, if you look at a plasma donut from a superset of the tetracubic spirals named Hebrew and Sanskrit, the superset of those spirals on the torus plasma self-organizing, the physics of alphabet, is called the hypercube, and that's the Ophanim Enochian alphabet used to make the movie Stargate, and that's the physics of basically perfected implosion. So by focusing on one particular plasma donut symmetry at a time called the sacred letter, in the case of Hebrew, that would be a rabbi making
my eye twitch.
But in the case of Ophanim Enochian, you're calling interstellar plasma intelligence, whose bodies are assembled of plasma donuts by the symmetry we call hypercube, and that's literally angelic physics. Remember that all of the scientists who built the Plasma Universe website, they all believe in angels now, that large plasma intelligence. That's old news. But large plasma intelligences are the solution to places on Earth whose tornadoes need steering. And basically, that's the Tempest. That's the Shakespeare play. That's the Tempest story. And so, in fact, the direction from which the storm that took out the Spanish Armada was unprecedented, we believe, in meteorological history. And the Spaniards who were then stranded on the coast of Ireland are still growing up in Ireland today because of that storm. That's a short.
So a storm happened, and they called it.
We can go into the physics of alchemy more there, too.
They wanted it to happen.
Sure, yes. Alchemy is something that interests me quite a bit. In one of your videos, the text of it says that in terms of the history of alchemy as centripetal plasma science, alchemy as practiced in ancient Egypt might well be considered an ancient breakthrough technology using the sacred geometry of the temple itself as the container, and that's quite interesting.
Well, Vincent Bridges, who I worked with on this for many years, who narrated most of the television series on Nostradamus, History Channel, etc., believed, and I think correctly, that most of the gold in Egypt was made alchemically. An example, the reason mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe for 300 years is not because those Egyptians in the mummy ate gold powder. Wrong. No, it's because the dielectric capacitance in the natron in the mummification process was introduction to the alchemizing principle which converted that flesh into an Ormuz amulet. And it was that gold powder amulet in the flesh that was so important in every pharmacy in Europe. So that gives you a little intro. But the more colorful part of that story is there's a certain period in history called the Mad Caliph at the time, just before the First Crusade. He went insane because he was eating the powder used by his alchemists of the ground-up Kaba stone. And we know the physics, in that particular glass meteorite, the vaporized gold foam sandwich forms a nano-implosive that makes it extremely high dielectric. And so that red powder, later called projected powder, or the Philosopher's Stone. So when Peter the Hermit,
the Philosopher's Stone,
was
really?
the salesman who sold the First Crusade to the bankers of
What
Europe.
the hell's in my window, guy?
When he saw that the Muslims had achieved the first real alchemy, that's when he went back and sold the First Crusade. It's been too long of a story, and Vincent, in his incarnation there, got stuck in that crusade. But let's say that red powder, in Vincent's other lifetimes as both Flamel and Kelly, he made the purest gold that had ever been made as measured by the British Royal Society, actually, in that day. Those transmutations are extremely well documented in history. It's not fantasy. It has to do with the catalyzing of the non-destructive isotope collapse between electron shells by a properly distributed superdielectric in the red-hot mercury, which you remember is only one electron difference. The nucleus is the same as gold. So basically it's LENR, low energy reaction. It's a catalyzed non-destructive charge collapse. And that is a good introduction to what alchem means in place of the blacklist for black blood, original name for Egypt, because it is about the physics of implosion. And it's true that some of that powder, if it's done correctly, you kind of live forever. That's why the Mad Caliph was eating it in the first place. Obviously, he didn't do it right. So, a little introduction to that story.
I like it. I think we really are going to just be getting little introductions to so many different things because every different subject you get into is so deep. I wanted to talk about these plasma beings, but before we do that, maybe we should talk about language because this is a big part of your work. You break down the characters of alphabets like ancient Hebrew, Sanskrit, and even Enochian.
Yes, I do. Yes.
And you show that these letters or characters are pieces of the higher dimensional superstructure that is the universe. As I pulled from one of your previous interviews, another way to say it is that you view Enochian as a nested system of multidimensional geometries, a bioenergetic machine provided to humans from the outside to help jumpstart our own evolution. Pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I have the maps how to do that.
We don't have here. It is kind of clear how you could see the logic of a higher dimensional being giving us two-dimensional pieces of a 3 or 4 or 5-dimensional superstructure, and they just look like these little squiggles from our perspective. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job explaining this, but maybe you could do better.
I like the way you bring color to the conversation.
It's colorful.
But more specifically, from the mathematic point of view, what I did was I took the equation for the self-organizing golden spiral and superposed that topologically on my new equation for a nest of donut torui, which are also self-organizing. And put the spiral on the torus, and then look at the shadows of that one spiral on that torus, indexed by the
Torus is always right.
arrows of the tetra. The shadows are Hebrew and Sanskrit animations. goldenmean.info/DNA ring. Now, the cubic algorithm for assembling magnetic donuts is the beginning of, for example, DNA codons, and certainly the physics of the atomic table, or platonic nesting of toroids, is the only thing physics has to talk about. But the superset of that was that if you take the tetracubic symmetry and embed it in a rotating cube embedded in a dodecacosa, the superset of those same vortex on the same tori. Remember, there's only one spiral on one donut. The shadows are, from many one, e pluribus unum, was the entire alphabet. So that was the index. For example, if you visualize one Hebrew letter at a time and fill the optical cortex, you're literally creating a smoke ring inside your head, and when you blow it, you can nest them to make Golembo tornadoes. Literally, the only physics of creation, nesting with charged donuts. The superset, Wolfenum Enochian, of that same in hypercube symmetry, you can see the visuals again at goldenmean.info/Wolfenum. And indeed, and we must credit Vincent and Darlene for working out those structures. I didn't wish up with them. They worked out the hypercube Wolfenum Enochian. And basically, it's simple. When you say the next dimension, the only thing you mean is the next superposed axis of spin symmetry, which adds the potential for increased spin density, but also information density.
Because you bring what you created with you.
Cannot
so it has to be more
rotate any
dense.
vortex array upon tetracube unless you use Golden ratio, which is exactly how 5 cubes embed in pentodeca. And that's essentially the only possible
5 devices embedded as one.
If you rotate that then dodeca down the helix, that's a perfect exquisite map of DNA. Goldenmean.info says DNA manifesto for the visuals. And as you braid the braid on that braid, string to rope to fat rope, which is the physics of bliss, by phonon embedding, the plot thickens, and that actually causes your DNA to implode. And that's the physics of how you get a soul, essentially.
That's how I feel right now.
Dream, you get a
Third time listening to this guy.
Objective, and that's when you will then take something through death.
Well said. Yes, I have in my notes here that you have said this science of implosion and vortexing is the key to understanding the life force inside of a seed, how souls form in DNA, principles of zero-point energy, how lucid dreaming works, and all sorts of things where it does feel like the key is imploding pressure and then an energy emerges. And when you visualize all those different things, at least for me, I do think it's kind of clear how you could see that template applying to them.
Yes, and let's try to get super practical, sort of electrical engineering about that. We built a plasma generator called Theraphi, THERAPHI.net, which is successful in 25 countries doing rejuvenation, pain reduction. We don't make medical claims, but it's based on prairie. It's very, very successful. You can read the results there. But notably that, and we use a broad spectral phase conjugate wave that's based exactly on my equation named origin of biological entropy, titled my book, Symptom clock times Golden ratio. And we take that cascade and dump it in half a million volts, big pine cone into that noble gas phase conjugate optical plasma, and it's big pine cones kissing noses, and it's amazing. And the reason I bring it up here is because it's a demonstrated, documented trigger for lucid dreaming. And we know that's a major indicator, probably the indicator, of whether you'll take memory through death, which means simply that you have become longitudinally plasma projected, the physics of Shamanism, remote viewing, and what's called rainbow body, Kesjan body. In all these names, we have etheric body. It's in fact the bubble of electrical coherence around your aura becomes centripetal enough that you can then embed the longitudinal components of this wave array. For example, in my case, after many years of working, you began to develop clairaudience. You hear ancestors in sacred sites with the Cherokee, for example. So that array is the physics of the collective unconscious. And the way to make phone calls there is your aura has to be longitudinally coherent enough to be plasma projected. Also, why when you use that cascade, you can trigger not just bliss brainwaves, but you can trigger ability to astral travel.
I love it. And Theraphi Plasma Regeneration Centers. These exist in California, Vegas, Oregon, Colorado, many other places. I looked this up. I mean, this is pretty impressive that these centers have all adopted this technology, this system that you discovered and put together. Some of these centers also offer hydroxy gas inhalation. We had a previous guest, George Wiseman, go on about the importance of hydrogen and this hydrogen-oxygen gas, and it also seems to play a key role in regeneration.
Remember I said, like, it's like a candle, that the fire is a tetrahedron. That's the shape. And I think the eternal flame, which is down there in Ottawa, the flame always burns, is because you always have to off-gas the hydrogen, and you have to have like a flame going to off-gas the hydrogen. So when I think that these batteries are running, not only will they produce hydrogen, that has to be, burned off, it'll create oxygen as well for our planet to get better.
And hydrogen is a big part of the Therify plasma regeneration too, isn't it?
Exactly. In fact, the frequency cascade that I prove is the radium hydrogen is the core of the Therify cascade frequencies, as are the Schumann harmonics and brainwave harmonics of bliss in the infrasonic component. And yes, it's true that it was I who originally proved the fractal structure of hydrogen, which is why it's so negotropic, especially in its nano or monoatomic state. So yes, for example, our Las Vegas Center of Bliss and Pascal.
We're just looking at things that are too small to see.
Hydrogen, etc. It's true that also extra hydrogen in water is the key to healing, and we have a technology for that, theimploder.com, which uses implosion vortex. But yes,
it's 10 websites now.
That is, I don't know, there's 20 or 30 or 40 centers in the USA, and then that many more in other countries around the world. It's gone viral, what can I say? But I must say that my partner, I'm the co-inventor with Paul Harris in Western Canada, who probably is the world's leading teacher of hands-on alchemy as well, actually. So there are two of us. But you see, I discovered the physics. Antoine Priory is the precedent there, who famously healed tens of thousands of cancers here in France, documented by the French government. But he was spending millions to build each one of his gadgets and didn't have a clue of the physics principle, unfortunately. Did not know what phase.
Millions of dollars spent on not making wireless energy devices.
Frequencies from Rife and Minkowski and Tesla. And it turns out that in that process, they tripped very closely the cascade predicted by my equation. So when I discovered that my equation predicted more accurately the frequencies Antoine Priory was using in France, then we were able to perfect it. Specifically, Priory didn't even know that you needed opposing pairs of sources, which is critical to phase conjugation, as any laser optics person would tell you. You got to have two pine cones, kiss noses, great implosion in the center. And then we did a broad spectrum by equation, but you can read the physics very well articulated there at verify.net. And you're right, it's about a centripetal plasma tornado. We have many technologies that are doing that, and even our carbon nano. A lot of things are quicker. But our water tech is very successful also, the imploder.com. And our brainwave tech uses the same frequencies, playing the mind up.
Very cool. I spent a lot of time on that website, and you have used this phrase where pine cones kiss noses a couple of times. And I think the most obvious imagery that people would think of is those ancient depictions of Gilgamesh, or it's shown up several other places where there's a person holding a pine cone out, typically with a small bag in the other hand. It's a pretty ubiquitous ancient carving or symbol. Is this what you're getting at? Did the ancients obviously have this sort of knowledge base that we've just, I guess, lost over time?
Well, we think that Hermes Thoth, symbol caduceus, is what today is called phase conjugation, for one thing. And that is the physics of life force, and that's hermetically sealed, as it were. And
you're hermetically sealed.
The pine cone is also the way they serve their white gold powder, which is why it's depicted at Rennes Chateau. But it's also a pine cone is very practical tool for rainmaking. You can use it as well, actually. And the purse, we think, was, they say it was a home received, but actually the Sumerian monarchy, they had a green pure crystal, which is functional of pureness. In fact, they had wars over pureness.
My Marge Simpson bathroom.
Pureness is ME, as in May, Asa, Ur, measurement. And as Sitchin, I think, did get that right. And so that's what the purse was looking for. The pine cone mechanism of light force generation. A very practical way to remember how that worked is well documented in the Sumerian and the Anunnaki that when they arrived here, they were running from the Pleiadian plains. Their literature is clear. They were aging catastrophically, prematurely, and they would do what's called raise a Shem unto the Lord, which at that time was mistranslated as I will build an altar to God. But actually, the word Shem refers to what an altar is, which is implosive capacitance, because that is the only age-reversing technology that saved their lives. So phase conjugate time reversal, actually, which today you would call age reversal, is what they meant when they said, I will build a Shem unto the Lord. Shem also means black hole, which is also build time reversal. So to be able to build a paramagnetic structure that was charge implosive was the beginning of their ability to not age catastrophically because they were used to neotropic environments. That practical example is that picture they call the light bulb in stone pyramid Egyptian light bulb. It's not just a light bulb, it's a plasma tube. It's literally the logo for Verify.net because that kind of age reversal technology, Hashem to the Lord, was central to all the Sumerian literature. So yes, they knew something about it.
When you say phase conjugate, is that kind of like a phase lock or a synchronization of this energy? Is that a way people should think of it?
Well, I think let's be as concrete as we can be to people who know some physics. If you want to phase conjugate lasers, you must have them angstrom level accurate, opposing from opposite direction 180 degrees out of phase, and they must meet in a super high dielectric called a phase conjugate mirror, which incidentally is how the Olmec telephone ancestors in obsidian mirrors, of which John did for ancestor phone calls, because the phase conjugate mirror embeds longitudinal and thus ancestor phone calls. So in physics, the phase conjugate mirror is the first place optically where time reversal and neg entropy was measured. Now, if you ask a physicist how that works, they don't have a clue. But what they do know is that the super dielectric material is key. In the case of conventional phase conjugate optics, it's barium titanate. In the case of the ancients, it was the ground up rock powder, the pumice.
Insulator or conductor.
In both cases, super high dielectric enabled permissive, non-destructive charge collapse at angstrom quantum levels, which means the pine cones got to kiss noses permissively, enabling the implosion through the speed of light at the Planck threshold, called phase conjugation, which is specifically where the waves can conjugate perfectly, and which no physicist before me realized is precisely the problem only solved by golden mean ratio.
.com.
By the way, my friend Bob Roswell,
Bob Ross.
that if you want to use the lasers to trigger medicine under the skin, the best way to get no heating was golden ratio.
Wow.
But so phase conjugation basically is a name for implosion in subquantum distances to and to Planck, by golden ratio, ultimately. In phase conjugate magnetics, for example, I invented, as Elizabeth Rauscher confirmed, when she measured the frequencies of magnetism, which caused pain reduction in her FDA trials. And later she saw that I predicted what those frequencies are by equation, which, by the way, are the frequencies emitted by the magnetic coil at Verify.net. So phase conjugate magnetics and phase conjugate dielectrics. Phase conjugate dielectrics are very cool. The paper on it is called Alice in Barium Titanate Land. That's the paper on phase conjugate dielectric. It gives you a clue because self-organization is so little understood.
You're a self and I'm a self, and we should organize.
Phase conjugate field over here.
No, this is nonsense, but
find the one on the other side of the room. Self-awareness is a name for the implosion that results from phase conjugation. That's what self-awareness is. The ability to non-destructively self-re-enter the electrical definition of consciousness also defines the perfect implosive plasma vortex, phase conjugation.
Well, now it all makes sense. It's dense stuff, man, but it is super fascinating to hear about. And let's talk about John Dee's angels, or these higher beings. Maybe angels was a bad term to apply to them from the beginning, but you say they are giant plasma beings, and let me just read this quote here. When the plasma domains, which are the sacred letters, converge at conjugate angles, they create a centripetal force, where pine cones kiss noses, and there you access ancestral memory and the collective unconscious because they are plasma. And there you access very large interstellar plasma beings, and there the larger context of life emerges. So our ability to communicate with these very large plasma beings, I view personally as being survival critical for our species. Wow, well, you gotta tell us a bit more. What are the steps people can take to move towards this communication, and why is it so important?
Well, again, let's try to be as concrete as possible in the first part of that question, which is, the reason our tornadoes are unsteered is the same reason our elementals are not acknowledged. By not playing with the elementals, we condemn ourselves to drought and tornadoes. It's literally true. Plasma beings are so integral to the success of nature that if we don't work with them actively, we are condemned to death, quite literally. And they regard us as drunk and stupid because we don't work with them and talk with them and play with them. I was at Findor, I know the story. But those plasma beings are just like any other orb. If you've got fresh cut biological material like trees, you'll have orbs all over the place, plasma. But if you got a metal, steel, aluminum building with electrosmog, every single orb and plasma elemental and ghost is immediately toast, killed, dead. So our urban areas are automatically at instant death of every plasma living elemental being because it is non-permissive to charge distribution. So charge distribution efficiency describes not just consciousness, but only the place where self-organization, living plasma can form. The same reason why Verify.net works if you get a room full of natural material, but doesn't work if you get a room full of metal and electrosmog. The same reason why negative ion wind, hospital proven to be profoundly healing, is immediately dead if you fill the room with synthetics and electrosmog and metal. So that's an introduction to talking to living plasma and living plasma beings locally. We have pictures, goldenmean.info/geobiology. And we must, it's urgent, that we teach our children to work with the elemental forces if our species is to survive. That is absolutely clear. But you see, the problem is we don't even realize that the aura around the human body is the only way to get an immune system and survive death. So how can we possibly deal with plasma beings of our plants and, our nature? So we must realize that plasma clouds are life. And once we do, then we can talk about the big ones.
Great points. Plasma clouds are life. I'm on board with that. Even though it feels like we're conditioned away from a lot of the type of thinking and information that you're so focused on. And it makes me wonder about your thoughts on what the elite predator class knows about these things. Because there is a presentation you've given called The Mystery of the Pentagram in Ceremonial Magic and its connection to the angelic ophanic working. And in it, you say that what you're doing with a pentagram is creating a self-organizing sacred space. And in the description of this presentation, you mentioned pentagram equals pentagon. And that stuck out to me. Are you implying that the builders of the Pentagon knew something about these principles and created their own self-organizing sacred space? Because there's plenty of evidence the CIA has definitely studied these things without advertising it very much. Clearly, there's a lot of power in this stuff, and thus an incentive to protect it from being widely known. Do you get the sense that someone up there at the top of the pyramid understands and preserves this sort of knowledge? Or perhaps even weaponizes it against the commoners? What do you think?
Well, you're asking a big question. I mean, clearly the government has been experimenting with remote viewing and other things for decades. That's obvious. The tragedy actually is, the one part of that tragedy that I would like to focus on here is after the Canadians and Maria Orsic taught the Nazis how to make a mercury vortex implode from Vimana that became Honolulu. The Nazis then ejected Admiral Byrd from South America and then took over a good chunk of Mars, the moon, and now Ceres, and are taking over the solar system. The reason the U.S. government lied the American people about losing to the Nazis is because they were too stupid to figure out why an object falls to the ground and how a vortex makes gravity. And that is a big tragedy and causes a schizophrenic government. That's an example of a predator class. I would agree with you. And that entire story with all detail, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. You can read the whole story. Basically, the secret space program, SSP survivors, dozens of them tell exactly the same story, so the government has no plausible deniability. So they have been lying to you for years about losing to the Nazis. And that's just the beginning, because there are lots of ET parasites, good guys and bad guys out there. That's the ET history. I've been teaching that for 10 years. You can read about it at our link there. I don't know how deep you want to go into that stuff tonight. But yes, and the U.S. government was implicated in that for sure, because they made the treaty with the wrong Greys and who were bought out by the Dracos at that time. So it's a very messy situation. I absolutely agree with you. And until Earth humans come to realize their place in interstellar politics,
Fucking idiots.
you're going to be the subject of parasites. It's clear.
Fucking learn math.
Our YouTube channel has 1 million views plus telling exactly that story. YouTube.com/DanWinterField.
Yeah, I had a note here about
the
Greys
guy in,
I wanted to ask about. So
M. Night
in
Shyamalan
today's
there.
world, we've
they're just trying to
lost so
sell
much
soda.
of this energy, so much of the soul, we could say. And it seems like a super powerful thing. We haven't even talked too much about astral travel or portals, but this energy is a big part of it. And I've heard you say it's this essence that the Greys had been extracting from people during these abduction experiences, which makes a lot more sense to me now, because you would hear things about, oh, they're after our souls. And, I guess we think of that in a certain spiritual context, but if you think of it more as like prana energy or our
wasting your time.
Or that this energy
vampire
has like really powerful multidisciplinary applications, that's what they were after. I mean, I don't know. I like that framing of it, but talk to us a little bit more about the abduction experience and what the Greys seem to be trying to get out of us.
Remember, the Greys, first of all, they don't like to be called that. The Khmer, originally from reticulum, but they lost what we would call a soul.
Blacks don't like being called blacks. Whiteys don't like being called whiteys. Greys don't even like being called greys.
Mostly paid for by groups like the Dracos, so you wouldn't blame them so directly, but more indirectly. There's actually some very useful groups of Greys as well. But the bigger story, and that's the important story, is why all these ETs are here stealing from the DNA library of humans. And that's the physics that's of interest. I often use the story of the Pleiadian Tegata, who are female-dominated Kosha and Cosmic Agency YouTube channel. They're hyper-controlling, female-dominated, 80% women. They use parthenogenesis for everything. And their gene pool is dying, as the Andromedans pronounce, because losing what we would call a soul, which now we know exactly what that is, that's the ability of DNA to implode. And actually, the Dracos have a similar problem. They admit they've lost long-term memory. So of the many, and there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of ET cultures preying on Earth. Some of them are trying to help Galactic Federation led by the Andromedans. They're trying to keep the parasites out. But it's a very complicated situation. But the basics of the situation is the most valuable thing here is the DNA library. And the valuable thing about the DNA library is what you would call getting a soul back into DNA, what I call Humpty Dumpty's egg. Very practical example is who can make a kid who can lucid dream? That's the issue. Because, when the Draco Charlie ran Montauk, they had to swipe the kids. They abducted the kids who could lucid dream. When they abducted the kids for SSP, Secret Space Program, it's the kids who could lucid dream. It's kids who had coherent longitudinal something in their aura, what we call a soul, which makes them psychokinetic. That is the magic recipe. And that's Humpty Dumpty's egg. That's the physics of the Holy Grail, which we're just teaching about now. that fractality. And that's what everybody's here to steal. And
Holy Grail?
that's exactly
he went there?
As a species,
He went there. He said Holy Grail.
as we jump into AI and vaccinations and all the things that cost your kids their soul. So until we know what a soul is, in electrical engineering and genetic engineering terms, we're going to be condemned to the board, unfortunately. So we must, as a species, learn the difference between AI and having a soul, or we're toast. To the Elon Musk worldview, which is, you need an implant, you need Borg, and you need a machine. Wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody was machine?
Right.
So the physics is, as I say, the definition of culture is if you can teach your child how to have a bliss experience, and the Aboriginals would agree. Now the Italians agree, because that's when you begin to form actually this coherent charge bubble. So, and once you can answer that question, then you can make a decision about what technology you want to use and what you don't. Like Steiner said, after 7 years
The
old,
Knights of the Round Table.
that child loses the inner muscle to make an image inside their head to imagine specifically because they
Or is it
lose
a picnic
the nervous
table with seats?
capability in their brain because they can't
Which
make
table do you like?
because they've always been had their
Pretty
pictures
tough.
generated from the outside. Whereas in the Steiner school,
Oh.
you teach the kids to draw a rose clear enough and then close your eyes and imagine the rose clear enough. And they determine when the child has succeeded because the room fills with the smell.
The round table, idiots.
We teach the physics of why.
Monty Python much?
Physics of olfaction, infrared propagation.
Wow. And so I could definitely start letting you go, but before we do, let's talk a bit about your inventions and the applications of your discoveries, because there are a lot. We talked about some, but definitely not all. We talked about Therify plasma regeneration centers. We talked about Flame and Mind, brainwave empowerment, bliss biofeedback. You did mention the water imploder, which is kind of a vortexer, and that's very interesting. You have a testimonial from a marijuana farmer on there that he had 168% growth benefit, and he's got images the whole way from seedlings to flowering marijuana plants, and it was impressive to see that one set clearly did benefit, and he says that is all due to your water imploder. And I know another one of your things that we haven't spoken much about is the heart tuner, and another one is the ECAT energy catalyzer. Maybe you want to tell us about those things and where people can get them, and any other things I might have left out of this long list of applications and inventions that you do have.
Well, thank you. Therify.net on the plasma is pretty self-explanatory. FlameandMind.com use the same frequencies for brainwave bliss entrainment and audio binaural bliss.
I hope you enjoyed this.
TheImploder.com has the water vortex shower restraint vortex imploder.
Is he done?
Super imploder is now been replaced by very commercial 1-inch solid stainless ultra imploder there. And so, yes, indeed, you have that implosive vortex adding solubility and therefore bioavailability.
Or learn math.
Water. Amazing effect on taste as well as growth and hypersolidarity.
Once we learn math, we can organize.
It's also true now that the Therify plasma is being used to trigger seed germination dramatically. For example, in Nashville, David there says the flower shop across the street, the flowers have doubled their life.
The tree of life and the flower of life.
The presence of Therify plasma is a universal report. Plants respond amazingly to central pedal force of plasma. And the same marijuana growers who originally said 160% or more growth by
Flower,
marijuana plants
tree.
now say they're getting growth effects in
Pine
the
cone.
rate of 100% increase in growth. From sapping the seeds from the plasma before germination, which is what we think one of the original functions of pyramids were, or sapping seeds with the necessary centripetal force, the definition of life or death for a seed. So then, and actually our wonderful biodynamic scientist just is now using Therify for biodynamic preparations, etc., for agriculture. So yes, growth and life force, buildings and plasma, we're doing a lot. Now, as far as the nanotechnologies, well, we have a nano-confidential carbon project, which is way beyond fullerenes, but I can't go into that too much right now, other than to say that once we learn to rotate the conjugate group, it will make every other form of energy
Rotate something else.
look like the Stone Ages.
Absolutely. Yeah, it'll make everything look like the Stone Ages.
Like rotated conjugator must start with carbon nano, for example, at least 99% pure. And no one else on the planet knows how to do that, actually. But here's an example that in the USA, the 60 cycle, which is Tesla's mistake, is not conjugate to quark. Whereas in Europe, it's 50 cycle, which is exactly golden ratio times quark. And in that environment, you can grow carbon. So there's some difference.
We all know about Tesla and what's his face?
Base conjugate negative to grow. So this affects the future of nanotechnology and our understanding of the difference between AI and so much. In fact, I would almost like to end on that thought, that once we understand the difference between what happens in DNA and what happens in AI, we will understand what it is to have a soul, and we can decide when AI technologies are not respecting what our children need to be in order to have a soul for our futures.
Learn math.
So we really need to get articulate.
Your kids should get up to speed on math before you do.
Right on. Well, yes, on that note, we can definitely wrap it up. The people grumble quite loudly if we don't have a full show, but I can massage the last few minutes, and hopefully they'll forgive us because we...
All right, I'm not massaging. I'm done. It's an hour. Said a lot, but said nothing at all. But if you put all the pieces together, it kind of resembles a talk that I might have, which I hope I did. And the closest thing I've ever done to a podcast. So I gotta go work soon. I'm really tired.